Our club has always been a forum for public figures, thought leaders, and decision makers to share their ideas. Here, we offer access to dynamic political, business, and public personalities.
We are dedicated to encouraging debate on the issues that matter to this city, this province, and this country.
The Canadian Club is one of the most important podiums anywhere in the world that a Canadian can speak to, tell Canadians what it is that they think, develop those thoughts. And so I want to thank you for that very, very much.
Please join me in thanking our esteemed panelists today.
Through our programs and events, including our youth and young leaders programs, our diversity partnerships, our joint events, and our media and social media opportunities, we offer you access to dynamic political, social, and business figures from abroad and right here at home.
The platform from which the eloquence of Canada has flowed all of that time, whether it be business, education, politics, sports, arts, and culture. If someone wants to say something to Canadians about this country and about the future of this country, this is the venue you choose.
Good afternoon, members and guests. My name is David Simmons. I'm president of the Canadian Club Toronto and your host for today's event. Welcome. We are very grateful to have the opportunity to hear from one of our country's inspirational Indigenous leaders on the importance of self-determination. It's the Canadian Club's 125th season. We're very proud to host the conversations that matter to Canadians. And over the last few years, we've been relentless in pursuing diverse stories from diverse leaders that tell Canada's story in full. And so we're thrilled to have our speaker here today. Our level of engagement with members and guests has increased significantly over the last few years. There was this thing that forced us to go online for a little while. The team did a good job, and now we're able to welcome hundreds of more people to today's event. They're now joining us live online. As you watch today's event and join us from online, you can engage with questions by clicking the Submit a Question tab on your screen. You can also use hashtags to engage with us across social media. For those of you in the room, not the womb, there are question cards on your table with hashtags that you can use to engage as well. The word Inuit means the people. The recent landmark Inuit Nunagat policy will promote prosperity and support community and individual well-being throughout Inuit Nunagat. The focus is on achieving socioeconomic and cultural equity between Inuit people and Canadians. Mr. Nathan Obed will provide more details shortly in his remarks. As I mentioned earlier, you can write your questions on the Q&A card. We have volunteers running throughout the room. They'll provide the Q&A cards on stage. I want to acknowledge our sponsors as well who help us put on this event and carry these conversations. Anico Eagles, represented by Amar Aljuni. BLG's represented by a number of guests at the student table, which I'll acknowledge shortly. And we have TD represented by Scott Belton, who's an executive member of the board here at the Canadian Club. We appreciate your support, and I'd ask the room to give you a round of applause. I'd also like to welcome students joining us today from the University of Toronto and the Leadership Lab at Toronto Metropolitan University. They're seated here in the front. Welcome them, please, guests and members. Now let me introduce our speaker. Nathan is the president of the Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami, or ITK, the national representational organization for the 6,000 Inuit people in the 60,000 Inuit people. I mentioned earlier to the online guests who are joining us, I'm learning a new language today, and Nathan has been very generous in helping me learn this new language. I'm going to make mistakes, which is part of our process. For someone who communicates for a living, I'm particularly nervous today, and it feels good to be nervous, you know? Sweating a little bit. So it's not 6, it's 60, and growing. Nathan was first elected 7 years ago and was acclaimed to his 3rd consecutive term last year. He grew up in Nain, the northernmost community of Nunatsiavut, which many of you may know as Northern Labrador. Numbers are the same in English, but I'm still mixing up my pages. Woo! The Tufts University graduate is the national spokesperson for Inuit in Canada and also serves as vice president of the Inuit Circumpolar Council Canada. As president, he implements the directions set out by the Inuit leadership from 4 regions: the Inuit Nangat, the Inuit Vialuit, the settlement region of the Northwest Territories, Nunavut, and Nunavik Nunatsiavut. For 10 years, he lived in Iqaluit and worked as the Director of Social and Cultural Development for Nunavut Tungat'ik, the organization that represents the rights of Nunavut's Inuit. He devoted his career to working with Inuit representational organizations to improve the well-being of Inuit peoples in Canada. Mr. Obed, I'm pleased to pass the Canadian Club podium to you.
Nakumik, and that was admirable, David. I really appreciate all the effort in using Inuktitut terms in your introduction, and thank you so much for the introduction. I'm really pleased to be here today, and I'd like to start by thanking those who made that possible, from Cisco to TD Bank, Canada Goose, Borden Ladner Gervais, Agnico Eagle, the Mental Health Commission of Canada, and all other organizations who have sponsored this event. Nakumik, thank you so much. I'd like to give my appreciation for your willingness to listen to this conversation. And also, I want to thank everyone for coming and being here, and also those people who are online. It's interesting that the focus in the beginning of this has been on language. And it's not just the languages that we speak, English, French, Inuktitut, any of the indigenous languages of this country. It is also the language that we describe this country of Canada that needs to change. The idea of what comprises Canada, the way that we speak about our country and the people within it, those are all evolving concepts. What we've seen in the Black Lives Matter movement, in the Me Too movement, and in the Indigenous reconciliation movement are voices that have been elevated to spaces that traditionally had not occupied the consciousness of the country. And the challenge of these movements and the challenge of Canada as a country as a whole depends upon our willingness to understand each other, to support one another, but to also believe that Canada can be better than it is today without having to undermine our faith in the country to do so. Inuit have always talked about being first Canadians and Canadians first. That is very different than perhaps First Nations or Métis, who have very different relationships with the Crown and with the country. But for Inuit, there has been a patriotism in spite of the challenges that we have faced from a colonial government and the imposition of colonial governments over time. I think this speaks to the pragmatism of Inuit in working with each other, especially when you consider where Inuit come from. Our homeland is a very challenging place to be, and one that depends upon goodwill amongst members of a community in order to survive. The life and death scenarios that we live in are in many ways constant, especially in winter, or when dealing in a marine environment where the ocean water temperature is 1 degree, 3 degrees, even in the middle of a summer. The way that we see the world has evolved from the necessity to respect one another and to get through things, to be resilient. And I think that gives us a platform and an open mind when we hear people and institutions say that they want to work with us to create a better world for our communities, our people, and for Canada. So a lot of what I do in my role as president of Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami is tell the story of Inuit to other Canadians, to be a spokesperson, to give a perspective that perhaps many other Canadians wouldn't have otherwise had. I also lead with saying that we are not a monoculture, and when I speak, I'm speaking on behalf of a governance, an institution that what I say is not just off the top of my head when I talk about Inuit positions, and that our governance model sits beside the governance model that perhaps you are more familiar with municipalities, provinces and territories, and the federal government. We have an Inuit governance model that also starts in communities that differs across Inuit Nunangat, but essentially is elected representatives of Inuit at regional levels, and then those 4 leaders of our 4 regions sit as the ITK Board of Directors and instruct me through resolution. So I'm elected not on my own platform or a party platform. I'm elected to serve the interests of Inuit nationally, and those interests are decided upon by the democratically elected leaders of each of our 4 regions. So that also means, in democracy, there's a wide variety of perspective and voice. It's vitally important for Canadians to understand that the Inuk that you might meet in your travels next month or 2 months from now might have a very poor opinion of me and might be completely opposed to the things that I might say here today that are Inuit positions. I would say that that is exactly the same type of scenario that you would find in Ottawa, in Toronto, in Kitchener, wherever you may find yourself when you're talking about regional, provincial, or national politics. It does not undermine the things that I might say to you. It just proves that we have a democracy and a diverse perspective amongst our population, just like any other society. I think sometimes that we are not afforded that, and that is a construct of, I think, colonial dominance, where the other is described as a homogeneous and fixed entity. It really stifles the ability for Inuit to be ourselves, even within our own communities. There are challenges for personal expression if your entire worldview is shaped in large part by what you can and can't do because of your ethnicity or because of who you are supposed to be. So personally, that's been a journey for me, is the ability to be myself in my role, be an Inuk, but also to be unapologetically who I am, even if some of those, parts of it, do Inuit run marathons? Well, I do. So, it's like Inuit might like to do things and might not like to do things, but there's a whole, if you come from a small community, there is a whole fishbowl approach to what perhaps you should do or shouldn't do. So I just pause on that because I think there are many people here who might not know our community very well. And I think that perspective is a really healthy perspective to take in any of the interactions that you might have with our community. Inuit are one of the 3 Indigenous peoples under Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution. The Constitution recognizes Inuit, Métis, and First Nations. Inuit live in major cities across Canada, but primarily Inuit live within our homeland, Inuit Nunangat. It stretches about 33% of Canada's landmass. It encompasses about 72% of Canada's coastline. It's a massive geopolitical space. And through modern treaties or comprehensive land claim agreements, Inuit either own or co-manage the entirety of that space and the adjacent waters. So politically, Inuit, although we may be about 65,000, we have an outsized importance when it comes to the governance of this country, the way economies function in our homeland, the way that decisions are made on water, on natural resources, on wildlife, that are government decisions, that are not just Inuit decisions. And it also is immensely important in the conversation around sovereignty. What does tie Canada's claim to sovereignty in Inuit Nunangat in the Arctic? It is the recognition that Inuit live in the Arctic and Inuit are Canadians. I think that point has not been made enough in the contemporary sense, even if in the 1950s it was such an important point that the Government of Canada relocated Inuit from northern Quebec to the high Arctic as human flagpoles to assert sovereignty in the time of the Cold War and the military buildup in Inuit Nunangat in the Arctic. So we have decided to call our homeland Inuit Nunangat. That's a term that I hope that all of you will adopt, if you have not already adopted, in the specific discussions around Inuit and the Inuit homeland. The term was described by our board members and then voted on by our board over 10 years ago now, when Mary Simon was president of ITK. I'm so proud that she is now the Governor General of this country, and I'm also proud that I get to name drop that. We have struggled to find our place within the Indigenous conversation, and our organization, ITK, was founded in 1971. Canada has such a varied and complex relationship with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. It is nonsensical in many ways. There are very few linear conversations you can have about how our existing rights are upheld, how our constructive arrangements have been implemented, and what the future holds for the relationship between Inuit in the Crown, First Nations, and Métis in this country. That means that we have so much work to do, especially with the federal government, in defining our space, in figuring out how to work constructively, and whether it is legislation or policies or programs or an overarching consideration of engagement in the protocol area. We are working with Canada and have worked with Canada, especially since 2015, on a reconciliation agenda that perhaps was at the time very naive and I would say very ambitious and genuine and heartfelt, but at the same time a vast lack of understanding of what is necessary in order to have productive relationships and to fully implement self-determination for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis in this country, and the absolute mess in the legislative, policy, and legal sense that often we find ourselves in when we're trying to work through constructive solutions for many of our policy areas. Across Canada, but especially in Inuit Nunangat, Inuit face staggering inequities. Canadian Inuit experience the highest rates of food insecurity of any Indigenous population in an industrialized nation. Our food insecurity rates are up to 70%, and that is a combined moderate and severe food insecurity as per the USDA mechanism to measure food insecurity. We also have an overcrowding rate of 52% in relation to 9% for the Canadian average. So you can see just with food insecurity and with housing, there's just these massive inequalities that exist between Southern Canadians and Inuit populations. We also have a foundational infrastructure deficit. To think that in Nunavut, a jurisdiction that is entirely linked to a marine environment, or there's one community in Baker Lake that is still linked to a marine environment but is on a lake, as the name implies, that there is only one deep sea port, and that is being built in Iqaluit. For marine and for air and also for water and sewer, our communities were never fully built in the first place. The idea of Canada, as I said in the opening, has not necessarily reached a practical level of implementation in the Arctic. There are only two roads that lead from the south, or two communities that are linked from the south to Inuit Nunagat communities, and that is in the Western Arctic, in Inuvik and in Tuktoyaktuk. So of our 51 communities, only 2 are linked by road, and then there are only 5 communities that are serviced by a seasonal marine ferry. So that means that the majority of our population either fly in or get sea lift once or twice a year for all the non-perishable goods and services that are required for communities. You can imagine in the time of COVID, where immediately society shifted in the South to online learning, also to working from home, to isolating when sick, to having access to testing. I know that testing was not always available, but for us, just imagine that there aren't testing facilities in our homeland, and that any of the COVID tests that community members took would have to go to plane to another jurisdiction, and then to wait in a queue based on a service agreement between that other jurisdiction and the jurisdiction in which that came from. So we're waiting sometimes between a week and 2 weeks for results on COVID testing. This also applies to areas such as tuberculosis. COVID response depended upon the ability to respond in a quick manner. And when people in the South didn't have that quick response, it was fascinating to hear about the public uprising and the public discord from governments not being able to provide basic services to constituents. In Inuit Nunagat, this is our general reality for the majority of our healthcare system. There are only a few hospitals across our 51 communities. The rest are served by health centers, which can provide a number of different very basic services, but are not serviced by doctors. So any care requiring a doctor, people have to be airlifted out of communities and into either regional centers or southern centers in places like Edmonton, Winnipeg, Ottawa, and Montreal. It's in this context of inequity and also challenges in basic service delivery that we have advocated for policy solutions with the federal government to reframe the way that government programs are designed, and also to work on our priority areas such as housing, homelessness, food insecurity, broad considerations for community development and economic development. We've worked constructively with the Government of Canada through the Inuit Crown Partnership Committee since 2017. It was a declaration that was signed in 2017 that basically created a venue for us to work together on things that were of major importance to Inuit and the Government of Canada. The Prime Minister chairs the Inuit Crown Partnership Committee on the Government of Canada side, and I chair the ICPC on the Inuit side. So 3 times a year we get together, and once with the Prime Minister and twice with between 5 and 7 cabinet ministers and Inuit leadership. We set work plans, we create priority areas, and then we reflect on our progress to date as the years go by. One of the areas that we decided to work on was the creation of an Inuit Nunagat policy. A policy for Inuit Nunagat considerations within the federal family is necessary because of the lack of engagement from many of the federal government's 30 departments when it comes to Indigenous issues and when it comes to Inuit-specific issues. Often within the federal system, the Crown Indigenous Relations and Indigenous Services departments get the lion's share of the expectations when it comes to working with Indigenous peoples. So say if you're in Infrastructure Canada or Agri-Food Canada, or any number of departments that aren't explicitly linked to an Indigenous service delivery, often you can just pass any of the Indigenous specific concerns over to those two departments. Because Inuit do not fall under the Indian Act, and because we work primarily with public governments in our jurisdictions and through relationships with the Crown and our comprehensive land claim agreements, often programs and services that are designed to be inclusive for Inuit had almost no ability to be inclusive. There are barriers both on the knowledge level and also then in the program design level that don't allow for Inuit to take advantage of many of the different programs and services that other Canadians and other Canadian jurisdictions implicitly could benefit from. This is largely because of the strange relationship that each of the Indigenous peoples have with Canada and with provinces and territories. Provinces and territories would often get funding that would be meant to also include Inuit, but then it decided to put on additional parameters perhaps, or to reallocate funds in different ways, or to provide services in a way that weren't consistent with what Inuit leadership and Inuit ourselves thought would be best practice. So the idea that we could create a policy that would then direct any single government department on how to respond to an opportunity, whether it was creation of legislation, the creation of policies, or the creation of programs, with an Inuit-specific lens to each initiative, would transform the way in which government functions. It would open up doors that have previously not been open for Inuit participation within government services, as Inuit are citizens of this country and parts of public governments, in addition to having the right to self-determination and various levels of self-determination in the way that we provide services to Inuit. I'll give housing as an example. There have been federal allocations to housing over the last 6 years that have been sorely needed. In this last budget, there was $845 million over 7 years for Inuit Nunagat housing. There were previous allocations in other budgets as well. In the pre-Inuit Nunagat policy era, that money would be allocated to the government of Newfoundland and Labrador, or the government of Quebec, the government of the Northwest Territories, the government of Nunavut. And then those governments would apply their particular policy directives and considerations on those funds. Now the relationship is directly between the Government of Canada and Inuit land claim leadership. So the 4 land claim regions, or 4 treaty organizations, are the ones that have the right to decide how those funds are spent and the right to decide how they partner, whether with private industry or with governments, to fulfill the obligations under the larger umbrella of the funding opportunity. It may seem like a elementary exercise that might even get us to the same end. Perhaps in some Inuit jurisdictions, there isn't a housing construction arm of the land claim organization. And perhaps they will need to partner with the public government jurisdiction. But the self-determination angle on this can't be understated. The ability for Inuit to decide for ourselves how to best utilize federal resources for the betterment of our communities and meeting the terms and conditions of the government opportunity while implementing self-determination and doing what we feel it could be a much better job in implementing services and funds for our priority areas and those areas that are the most dear to us. This also will spur economic development in our communities. The Government of Canada has talked quite a bit about elevating procurement standards or ensuring that Inuit and Indigenous people largely have a much larger role within federal procurement. This policy also sets out the guidelines for federal consideration of Inuit interests whenever there are economic opportunities. Also, the self-determination approach for any of these pots of funds will then allow for Inuit economic development interests to be considered in a much more complete way than if the interests were solely coming from a federal, territorial, or provincial interests. We imagine the Inuit Nunangat policy to be applied in many ways that could be transformative today, but over time that it will be transformative just on a general application level. The federal public service reimagining itself, a new language being spoken, if you will. And so often in the last 6 or 7 years, we as Inuit have passed up perhaps the short-term win of getting a specific announcement from a federal government about a number of dollars for a point-in-time activity. And we have purposefully decided to also pursue system change and say that that is just as important and in sometimes is more important than having that big announcement for that big pot of funds for 2 to 4 years that might, in the short term, change some of our communities' lives and community members, but in the long term entrenches a status quo that will forever see us needing those big federal announcements. Self-determination is the goal. And the ability for Inuit to be self-determining, to have self-governments, to be more economically independent, to encourage growth within our communities, to see sea change in the way in which we participate in the economy, the way that our education systems flow, the way that our health care is delivered. All of that depends upon our ability to forge a new path and a new relationship with this country, and in partnership, but also in keeping with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, on the Constitution, on Supreme Court rulings, and also on the will of Canadians to elect leaders who are going to see this through as a reconciliation agenda, but also are going to hold this country to account for the path that I believe we all want to share together towards shared prosperity. Thank you so much for the ability to talk to you today. Nakomik.
Thank you for... Hello, 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 hello. Don't stop till you get enough. Okay, it's working. Thank you for those remarks. It's interesting. Listening to your remarks, I was getting fired up, thinking the challenges that are facing the community that you represent are unique in so many ways, but as we tell Canada's story in full, there's a familiar tension, frustration for those of us who've had experience in public policy around how decisions are made and how they benefit the people who they should benefit. So thank you for continuing to educate so many of us in this journey towards building a better country. With that said, one of the questions we have from the audience, which I think is a nice way to start, given the reality of the world we're in today, what's making you hopeful for the future?
Well, I guess it starts with rooms like this, where the fact that that I would be somebody that people would want to hear from, that the Inuit perspective would be something that would be of interest to a larger community, that is relatively new. And so I've seen and witnessed, even in the last 6-7 years, Canada reimagining itself and also being more inclusive to all Indigenous peoples. And that gets me incredibly hopeful about what we're able to achieve together. And also that things can change. Mm-hmm. Like that when you work on policy or you work on legislation, often there is this kind of black hole that it goes into, where you're not a community leader. You're not seeing somebody's life change because you provided a service. You're imagining interventions happening in a myriad of different ways that you don't have anything to do with. Mm-hmm. But to see things change from a political level, to hear that reconciliation is now a part of the general conversation, it isn't just one party or one particular leader, those things make me hopeful. I think also just the general goodwill that we have towards one another in these spaces, that goes a long way as well.
Yeah, well, that's insightful. For those of you who have not worked in government or influenced in government, the black hole Nathan's referring to is called a budget consultation. I encourage all of you to try that out. This morning, truthfully, Danny's here from Canada Goose. I know their company's done a lot of work in the north and around reconciliation. Sustainability is sort of a word we use in corporate Canada. I was on a call this morning with our CEO with some Indigenous leaders around how we can show up better, listen as we move forward. An elder in Alberta said to me once, I went in with a presentation. I had Gantt charts and decks and slides, and I was board ready, as we like to say. And she reminded me that I was colonizing the effort, that I needed to just stop. I hear that a lot sometimes. What advice do you have for so many of us in the room who want to make a contribution to economic empowerment, to the self-determination you're talking about, as we consider the right step forward? Mm-hmm.
First off, don't try to be a hero, all right? Please don't try to save others. The respect is really the heart of the relationship to be productive. And it's the respect of meeting people and communities, the place where they are. And sometimes it means that you have to completely reorient what success looks like from your perspective or your corporation's perspective. It may not mean that you have to completely lose sight of your goals as an organization, profit margins, the larger initiative. It just means that if you imagine that you might have 10 young Inuit who are going to be mentored into senior roles in 3 years, and that you're going to go find them tomorrow. And if you don't find them, then you just give up and say, well, I tried, but I couldn't. Maybe the solution in scenarios like that is that say, what is possible? If what I imagined isn't possible, what can I do with the community? And can that fit within the corporate culture and environment and within the broad expectations of the relationship? That, to me, creates so many positive opportunities, and that other way often creates scenarios where you demand for communities to give you course correction, in confrontational ways, maybe, in ways that they stress out about too. So on the other side, people don't want to be disrespectful. People don't want to come in and tell you that everything you have to say is wrong. Mm-hmm. But if you come in and you don't give that space for an open conversation about what's possible, then that inevitably is what happens.
In 2016, you issued a report called Inuit Priorities for Canada's Climate Strategy. This past, I think, 12 months, we've seen a real inflection point, acceleration around the discussion as it concerns to carbon neutrality, Canada's role in achieving net zero. As that discussion accelerates, given your lived experience, given the community you represent and the real and present impacts that climate change is having to the community, what are your thoughts? Are we doing enough? Is carbon neutrality enough? How do we accelerate efforts in that space?
We aren't doing enough. I think I don't think I have to be on one side of this or the other just to say objectively, if our goal is net zero, we aren't doing enough today. I've heard a lot about competitiveness, and that is a reason for not doing more. I also think that electability of public officials is another reason why there isn't a more ambitious agenda. And for us, seeing our environment categorically change, and not just over my lifetime, but over the last 10 to 15 years. We are seeing unprecedented extreme weather events. We are seeing coastal erosion. Our sea ice cover is drastically less than it was even 20 years ago. We are concerned about the foundation of the Arctic ecosystem. We're seeing thawing permafrost and all the terrible effects that has. And so we are, in some cases, whether we like it or not, the canaries in the coal mine for just telling the story of the lived experience of climate change, especially drastic climate change effects. On the flip side, we aren't powerful enough to change the Canadian government's or industry's course today. But we just have to continue to have that conversation and just be as stark as possible without being disrespectful about the necessity to do more in relation to climate action.
Nathan, we are supposed to be wrapping right now, but speaking of power and privilege, I'm the president. So I'm going to extend the session by a few minutes because I think we have some important questions that we want to get through and ask for your grace in extending the session a little bit. If you have to leave, I'd ask you to do that thoughtfully, but I'm going to get through the next few questions if that's okay with the room. Can you talk to us a little bit about connectivity as a priority for ITK, whether that's optic fiber connectivity, information connectivity? You talked about transportation as a I won't call it a challenge because you didn't use that word, but as a unique dynamic of the region. What do the rest of us need to know about that, whether it's a priority and how we might raise the volume on that issue?
Yeah, with COVID, again, working from home, all of the Zoom meetings that you've all been on, the Teams meetings, they require a certain level of connectivity, a certain level of network performance. And for Inuit Nunagat, we still don't have that. We don't have basic connectivity. Ever since connectivity became a major consideration for government policy, Inuit regions have been behind perhaps in 3 to 4 generations of technology. So we still struggle for basic connectivity, let alone the type of connectivity that would allow for online learning, for medical care to happen remotely, and also for businesses. If between lack of connectivity and the extraordinarily high prices for shipping, there's almost no chance for small businesses to operate in the same way that small businesses operate in the South. I think also just for basic connectivity, as it has become more of a quasi-right of, just the expectation of Canadians is that you are able to connect. We still are struggling for that. And even in a place like Iqaluit, it's bandwidth dependent upon weather and on usage. So if you have a number of people using the system at a certain time, your internet is going to be much slower. Or if the storm comes in, you might have lack of access to the satellite. I mean, these are just things that I don't think many other Canadians ever have to consider. So connectivity is so important for business, for the running of the government, for our education system, for our healthcare system. And there are solutions that are possible. ITK doesn't have a particular project in mind, although we are supportive of our Inuit regions who are trying to partner and push connectivity projects through. I think of the hydro fiber link in the Kivalliq in the Central Arctic, and that project has been discussed for some time now. But that would not only provide greener energy into a number of our communities, but also would provide connectivity in a way that doesn't exist now. And it would be great if there was more urgency in government action on some of these.
I have two more questions for you from the audience. The first is, what role, you mentioned education, what role does that play in self-determination?
We talk about an Inuit self-determination perspective, and that Inuit communities and Inuit ourselves have certain skill levels that perhaps aren't on a resume, but exist because of life experience or because of the knowledge that we have from our families and from our elders. But even so, that doesn't mean that it always will exist. And we are still at a crisis point where we need to create an education system that brings the best of our Inuit knowledge and Canadian knowledge within the pedagogy of education together to ensure that our students have the best possible success, not only in Inuit Nunangat, but also in Canada. We have a real struggle in ensuring that we have enough teachers. We have low graduation rates. We have low access to post-secondary. And that will not create the type of workforce that will allow for the implementation of self-determination. So we do have a massive challenge. And it is up to us as leaders to figure out how to provide better education and better educational environments. But I think it's also up to public governments and systems to be able to respond to this new space that we're in that's trying to respect Inuit self-determination at the same time as a more status quo educational experience for students.
Much of the corporate conversation around a role that corporations can play in respecting reconciliation and self-determination is around economic empowerment. The northern regions in the country are resource rich in many respects. This question is related to the expansion of mining in the north and in territories that ITK represents. What advice do you have for mining companies as they think about expansion and some of the roadblocks, hurdles, challenges that they may face in partnering with ITK or communities in the region?
Yeah, our land claim agreements have specific provisions in them around resource development. And in each of the jurisdictions, there are impact benefit agreements, but there are also then different tranches of lands. So there could be Inuit-owned lands, or there could be just settlement area lands. And depending upon where potential projects are located, there may be the government and industry may have different obligations to Inuit. The biggest challenge has been the engagement with communities most adjacent, the ability to implement impact benefit agreements, the ability for all parties to make the most of the opportunity. So there are some universal challenges. where there will always be opposition to particular projects. There will always be a varying degree of perspective. And so if Inuit are inclined to sign an impact benefit agreement, to allow for access of corporate interest in the natural resource sector, there still are so many things that have to happen for it to go right. And the challenge has been often with mergers or with complete change of control. Sometimes there is that lost link from the person who came to the community and shook, the hand of the local leaders to now the person who is implementing the impact benefit agreement. And having the continuity there and having the relationship with community is something that is ongoing and not something that is point in time. But at the heart of it, for our self-determination to work best, our land claim agreements are structured in such a way that natural resource extraction is a part of the funding of the implementation of our self-governments, of the implementation of the things that we want most for our society. So Inuit are not in a place to just say categorically we don't want natural resource extraction. We're in a very privileged place in many cases in relation to First Nations and Métis in this country where we can work through our institutions to be able to make constructive decisions. But the partnership still is a thing at the heart of it that is not point in time. It's not something you can ever walk away from as an industry leader.
Relationships matter.
Yes.
Nathan, thank you for joining us today, and thank you for being here at the Canadian Club. On behalf of the club, thank you for sharing your vision on Inuit self-determination and prosperity with us today. The desire for socioeconomic, health equity, education equity are goals that we should all work towards in our efforts towards truth and reconciliation and building a better Canada. I speak on behalf of the club when I say we admire your resolve, your focus, and your resilience as you pursue these goals on behalf of ITK. So thank you. Before we close today's event, I want to again thank our sponsors, TD, BLG, and Eco Eagle. Did I say that right? Wow, yes, good. Let me also take a moment to invite you to our final events of the season. On Wednesday, June 8th, we host an impressive virtual panel of guest speakers who will discuss the future of conservatism in Canada. We hope you can join us. I'm away that day. Truly, I am away that day, but we have another host. Do a great job. And on the evening of June 22nd, I'm thrilled to be hosting our annual Pride celebration with guest Katie Duckshett from RBC and Andrew Kriegler from IROC. We're going to sit down and have a discussion on how business, politics, and civil society can prioritize 2S LGBTQ acceptance as we move to the agenda around queer rights and why it matters even more now. I'm proud to be the third openly queer president of the club in its 125-year history, so let's keep building forward. And on June 23rd, we host our final event of the season with John Graham, CEO of CPP Investments. They changed that name, Willa. It used to be CCPIB, right? Changed it. And he's going to join us to talk about how he's delivering on an agenda to grow our $539 billion fund in the face of rising inflation, market volatility, and changing climate. Let me conclude by thanking our AV's partners, Van Valkenburg Communications and LiveMeetings.ca, for making it possible for us to gather here physically as well as virtually. Thank you for being with us in person or online, and thank you for support of the club. Good afternoon.